choose diversity. Because who wants a one flavor world? Hello, beautiful people. I hope you're doing well wherever you are, whatever you're doing. If you watched the last episode, you saw me introduce two very lovely folks, two lovely women, my dear friends Nelufar and Nauzanin. Hello again.
Hello.
We did touch on this topic in the last week, about where you think humanity is going. Are we moving closer to unity or going backwards? And we were all of the idea that we are progressing, that we're moving forward. And we talked about some issues. Technology came up a lot. Can we go on a little deeper into some of the things that are being instrumental in our global society towards uniting us, and some of the things that you think may be working towards dividing us further? Because we still have wars going on, right? We still have racism. We still have anti-Semitism. We still don't have equality between the sexes. So there are those aspects as well, even though we are so positive about reaching unity.
You know, I think there's so many nuances, and I want to touch just on a couple of nuances. One of the things that gives me hope about the uniting of the world is that as humanity, we're also continuously learning and refining our understanding of certain things. And I'll give you a very specific example. For some time, as a culture, as a civilization, we have fine-tuned our understanding of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these principles. And we try to apply them in our workplaces, in our educational system, in our governance, in our even shopping experiences. So the world has been having this conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. When you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're very focused on groups. You know, you are part of a specific group, your voice should be included, right? But there's no balance towards the individuals within those groups. And so recently, one of the conversations that I've been very intrigued by is this dichotomy between diversity, equity, and inclusion and what is being called M.E.I, which is merit, excellence, and intelligence, which is very individually focused. So D.E.I versus M.E.I, really trying to bring together a process or spaces, or create spaces where every voice is welcomed, that groups are being included as groups, but attention is being given to individuals as well, because each individual is so unique, even within an ethnic group. So for example, I am part of an ethnic group. I'm Iranian American. In the United States, I would be considered an ethnic minority.
Right.
What does that mean about my having a voice? Does that mean that whatever I say represents the entire group of Iranian Americans?
Absolutely not.
Thank you. And so it's this.
Let me tell you why I think not, especially in many reasons, especially because I know you would have been a minority in Iran as well.
That's right.
Your place of birth.
That's right.
As a Baha'i, you would have been, you know, by adhering to a religion different than Islam, for being a Baha'i, you would have been persecuted. You would have been othered. So you have that within what you have now. So if for example, Iranian Americans are Zoroastrian, Baha'is, Christian, Muslims, then you have different groups within the groups. Sorry.
No, and that's the point right there, is we are constantly refining our understanding as a civilization, as a culture, because we're learning that there are nuances, even with a wonderful principle like DEI. It's a wonderful principle, though it is being attacked by some groups. Okay, let's be very honest here. But if you think about it, even within this principle of being inclusive and having all voices, it's very much looking at groups, not at individuals within that group who are very diverse. And so I'm fascinated right now by this conversation around DEI and M.E.I. I think that's where the conversation needs to go, is that both are needed. Both of these principles are needed in any setting. And I'm fascinated to hear what Nazanin thinks of this, because it really is sort of a new thing for me. So I'm going to punt this over to Nazanin.
I'd like to hear from Nazanin too, especially because she is multicultural in background.
Well, it's such an interesting question, and I hadn't thought about the interplay between EDI and MEI. I'm just very curious. Actually, I have a question for you, Nelufar. When I think about, in our community, we call it EDI, so I keep flipping the acronym on you. But, EDI, for example.
Say it in full, just so that the
sure.
audience it's easier for the audience to understand what we're talking about. I sometimes find that too many acronyms I lose it.
For sure. Well, when I've been quite involved with equity, diversity, and inclusion work within the film community, and part of that is advocating for policy in terms of funding diverse filmmakers, and that's something that's really been an ongoing issue in the Canadian film industry, with money being allocated, for example, to racialized groups in certain amounts. So, for example, the Indigenous Screen Office, the Black Screen Office, BIPOC Film and TV, these organizations would be allocated a certain amount of money. And so thinking of filmmakers within groups has sort of been the mechanism for being able to, allocate funding in a way that's tangible, that's sort of easy to understand, to process. But then with MEI, I'm trying to understand, that sort of, again, individualizes people within groups. And how can we be assured that funding is allocated towards, people from communities that haven't received an equitable amount of funding in the past? So I'm very curious about how that works. But I'm coming from a mixed background myself. My mom is Iranian. My dad is from Barbados, and I was born in Canada. At some point, I lived in French-speaking Canada, but was English-speaking. There's so many ways in which I could be othered, and it's so many ways that I didn't ever fit into a particular cultural community. And it became very difficult to see myself as a part of a particular group. But I've always seen myself as an individual, and my stories could be very individual within the film community. So for me, it's a very intriguing concept of MEI, and I'd love to hear your views on how that could interplay with policy. Film industry is one example, but I'm sure there's other examples we could explore.
One of the departments that rolls up to me at my workplace gives out scholarships and grants and fellowships to science students, specifically in physics, optics, photonics, that particular area. And we give out, like, over a 1-year process, close to $1 million in scholarships, fellowships, and grants.
Apply for a grant?
You're doing work in optics and photonics, of course.
Okay.
But one of the things I've been thinking about is the principle that underlies these funding activities has been diversity, equity, and inclusion, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, however you want to put it. But now, I need to also be thinking about merit, excellence, intelligence. What does that mean in terms of determining, when I have a certain pool of money and I have so many applicants for it who are from the same ethnic group, or from the same country, or from the same technical background? I have to kind of sit there and balance it. And to be honest with you, I am at the very start of my thinking about this. This is a recent conversation that I'm engaging in, but I think this has to color the way I move forward. A lot of people in Google and Microsoft and others are also having this conversation in terms of hiring. I would be curious to hear from others what their thoughts are on this, because I'm learning around this particular concept right now.
Well, thank you for sharing that which you do know. Nazanin, you mentioned that because of where you lived and because of your familial background, you had many sources of being the other. Now, did you have any challenges that you faced because of any of those situations, or did you feel that the diversity wherever you were was actually embraced?
It's a good question. I mean, to use a word from monk, it's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in so many ways because I find myself so connected on a deep level with people from different cultures, and once you've had the experience of being other, it's very difficult to then do the same thing to somebody else, to think of somebody else as an other. I think, biracial folks really have an advantage in thinking of the world in a different way. But it is a challenging experience when, let's say, within the Black community you're not Black enough, or within the Iranian community you're not Iranian enough, and people are always surprised when I can speak Persian. Or that I can understand Persian. Even people are always surprised. So you learn to float between different cultural settings, different environments, and I think being of mixed heritage, it's really strengthen my ability to listen and to try to understand others on a deep level. But it's I wouldn't change it, of course. It's a really beautiful experience.
Beautiful to hear about it. So I can imagine how beautiful it feels for you being it.
Yeah, for sure.
It's the embodiment of unity and diversity. You're diverse by your own being,
existence,
by your own existence, and yet you're one entity. If we thought of that in broader terms, it would make unity so simple. I love the way you said that you're not Black enough in the Black community, and you're not Persian enough or Iranian enough in the Iranian community. Maybe you face this too, Nelufar. I faced something like that because I came here, my sister and I, our family came here when my sister and I were mere children. I grew up in Canada, and also because I don't conform to certain traditions, but I love my Persian heritage still, even though I've become sort of westernized. I'm not Western enough for the Western community, and I'm certainly not Persian enough for the Iranian community. So there is that, that's mixed identity. So for you, it would even be stronger because it's more visible to the eye. Sorry, Nelufar, did you want to say something?
No. I just was agreeing with your description. Yes.
You probably go through the same thing, right?
I do. And people never quite know what I am. I have had people speak to me in Spanish, and when I said, I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish, I was told I should be ashamed of myself that I don't speak my mother tongue. I have been, oh yes.
They've been that far.
I have been lovingly accepted by some of our indigenous tribes here in the United States. I do look more Native American than I do anything else, our indigenous tribes here. I lived on the Navajo Hopi Reservation one summer, and it was just such a welcoming, loving experience.
Beautiful.
In different parts of the world, I'm kind of accepted. I mean, Goli, when we were in Israel, a lot of people thought I was Arab or Jewish.
Really?
So I do get that, but I think there's a lot more nuance when we're talking about racial injustice in North America. There's a lot more nuance to what Nauzanin just kind of touched on very eloquently.
Yes, very subtly and very eloquently.
I'm going to again go back to the fact that we are Baha'is today by chance, the three of us, and in the Baha'i tradition, the racial injustice in the United States is referred to as the most vital and challenging issue that we face, and
we can see that that's becoming the truth.
Exactly. There are so many factors here. Like, one of the things that I learned about just a few years ago that I had never thought about in terms of myself within this conversation was microaggressions. It's something that I had never thought about, but I was part of an exercise. And one of the questions that the facilitator asked, which I thought was mind-blowing for me. This was mind-blowing. She said, so you have a different name. I said, that's right, Nelufar. And she said, do people mispronounce it? I said, all the time. All the time people mispronounce it. She said, do you correct them? I said, yes, of course. When somebody mispronounces my name, I correct them. She said, are there some people who continue to mispronounce it after you correct them? I said, absolutely. And she said, that's a microaggression.
On that point, though, do they mispronounce it intentionally or because they can't learn how to pronounce it correctly?
You know, we live in a very connected world, going back to our conversation. People learn constantly, okay? They're learning constantly. Our human minds are not finite. So part of that growing is when somebody gives you a correction on something. And so this was, and I'm sure Nazanin, having worked in that area, has a lot more data than I do. I turned to Nazanin on this to get her perspective.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that, I think overt acts of racism are much more common in the United States, but microaggressions are very common in Canada. And when I did my study for telefilm called Building Inclusive Networks in the Film and Television Industry, we looked at reasons why BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous people of color folks are not attending industry networking sessions in the same proportions as their white counterparts. And the major factor for this was the death by 1,000 cuts, as they call it, microaggressions, and it could start as simple as a mispronunciation of somebody's name, but it could also be things like, within a social circle, when you're talking to somebody, they're looking past you and seeing who's more important to talk to within the room. I'm sure we've all, as women of color, we've had that experience. And those experiences become so degrading that eventually BIPOC women decide not to attend film festivals, networking sessions, markets. And that's really disheartening to see. And that's research about Canada. That's research about BIPOC filmmakers in Canada. And I would say, Canada has much more polite racism than experience in the States, but it's very much present, especially towards our Indigenous communities. But it's there. It's just beneath the surface. And the fact that my study was even published by Telefilm and the Canada Media Fund, the first qualitative study about, a topic like this that was ever published on those websites shows an advancement. It shows an advancement in our industry's way of thinking about inclusion. And that's heartening to see. There's still a lot more work to do, and we have to roll up our sleeves, as Goli says, you can't be lazy about it. You can never quit. We have to roll up our sleeves and continue working. But there is positive change that we can see within the film industry.
Thank God we've seen enough progress that gives us hope. And thank God that we sort of have that understanding that the world will go on and there is time for progress and there is time for a better society, humanity's well-being as the generations move forward. Now, before we end this segment, we touched on racism, which is a very, very crucial issue in the bigger topic of unity and diversity. But as you were expressing about your experiences, I couldn't help remembering some of the experiences, some of the micro aggressions I've seen as a woman. Nothing to do with color, nothing to do with religion, just being a woman.
There you go.
Not being taken seriously because I dress a certain way or that I care about doing my hair and makeup. Not, people talking over me to somebody they think is more important, who happens to be a man, but he doesn't have nearly as much credentials as I do, commenting on my legs in a very formal business gathering. I can go on. And I'm jaded. The Gloria Yazdani you see here laughing and making fun of things. I have to work on my joy, on my having hope, on my treading on. I have to work hard on it. I have to pray. I have to keep telling myself, you have a purpose in this life. You can't give up just because people or idiots or some powerful men look at you and they don't see who you are. They see who they want to see. So each episode, we're just going to handle one question, but I'm loving it. I'm enjoying it. And I hope that our audience is enjoying it. Again, I thought we might have 2 parts to this episode, but it looking like we will have 3 for sure. Let me say goodbye to the beautiful people who are watching us, and then we'll start a new question for a 3rd part in this episode. Thank you, beautiful people. If you enjoy this sort of a conversation, if it moves you in any way, if it gives you good food for thought, please support us by becoming a subscriber to our YouTube channel. Follow us on the various social media platforms. We are starting. This is new, and we would like to grow our following, and we would like more and more people to become engaged in this sort of a dialogue, because even a dialogue helps in improving society, in moving humanity forward to its noble destination. So anyway, I'm going to say goodbye, but the ladies, don't go anywhere. I'm coming right back to continue the rest of the conversation. Bye, everyone. Hope to see you again soon.